The sand in Darius's mouth tastes like copper and death. He's lying on his side in the middle of the western desert, 200 miles from anywhere, and he's been trying to swallow for the past 10 minutes, but there's no saliva left. His tongue has swollen to twice its normal size. It's black, cracked, bleeding. The sun above him isn't just hot. It's malevolent. A physical presence that's pressing down on him like a massive weight, crushing the life out of him degree by degree. The temperature is 127 degrees Fahrenheit. The sand beneath him is even hotter, hot enough to blister exposed skin in seconds. 3 days ago, Darius ran out of water. 2 days ago, he watched his closest friend drink his own urine and immediately vomit it back up, the retching so violent it tore something in his throat and he drowned in his own blood. Yesterday, Darius found a scorpion in his boot and he seriously considered eating it raw, not for the nutrition but for the tiny amount of moisture in its body. Today, Darius is dying. He's 28 years old. He's a professional soldier in the Persian army, an elite member of the Immortals, the best fighting force in the ancient world. 6 weeks ago, he was in Memphis, celebrating the greatest military conquest of his generation. He had a wife back in Persepolis. Her name was Roxana. They'd been married for 3 years. She was pregnant with their first child when he left. Now Darius is one of 50,000 men who are disappearing into the desert, and no one will ever know what happened to them. This is the true story of Cambyses' Lost Army, 50,000 Persian soldiers who walked into the western desert of Egypt in 524 BCE and vanished without a trace. For 2,500 years, historians dismissed it as myth, as exaggeration, as anti-Persian propaganda. But recent archaeological discoveries have found something horrifying. They may have actually found the army. And what happened to them was worse than anyone imagined. Welcome to Ash and Crown History, where we explore the darkest chapters of the past without sugarcoating or glorification. Today, we're following Darius and his fellow soldiers on a march into hell. A journey so catastrophic that it changed the course of the Persian Empire and drove their king into madness. Subscribe now because this is going to get dark. Let's go back to the beginning. Not 6 weeks ago, but to the moment that set all of this in motion. We need to understand who Cambyses was and why he made the decision that would kill 50,000 men. Cambyses II was born in 558 BCE, the son of Cyrus the Great, the legendary king who founded the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Cyrus wasn't just a conqueror. He was a visionary who created the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from modern-day Turkey to India, from the Caucasus Mountains to the Persian Gulf. Cyrus was also, by ancient standards, a remarkably humane ruler. When he conquered Babylon, he freed the Jews from captivity and allowed them to return to Jerusalem. He respected local religions and customs. He created a system of administration that allowed conquered peoples to maintain their own identities while benefiting from Persian protection and trade. The Bible calls Cyrus the Anointed One. The Persians called him the Father. History remembers him as Cyrus the Great, and Cambyses was his son. Imagine growing up in that shadow. Every day of your life you're compared to a living legend. Every decision you make is measured against your father's accomplishments. Every failure is a disappointment not just to you, but to an entire empire. Cambyses was groomed for kingship from birth. He received the best education available: military tactics, administration, multiple languages, diplomacy, religion. He was competent, capable, and by all accounts a skilled military commander. But he wasn't his father. When Cyrus died in 530 BCE, killed in battle against the Massagetè tribe, his head allegedly cut off and dropped in a bag of blood by Queen Tomyris as revenge for killing her son. Cambyses inherited the throne at age 28. 28 years old. Ruler of the largest empire on earth. Living in the shadow of a legend, Cambyses needed to prove himself. He needed a conquest so impressive that people would stop comparing him to his father and start judging him on his own merits. He chose Egypt. Egypt in 525 BCE was one of the oldest civilizations on earth. 3,000 years of continuous history. The pyramids were already ancient, built 2,000 years before Cambyses was born. Egyptian pharaohs had ruled when the Persians were still nomadic tribes in the Iranian plateau. Egypt was wealthy beyond imagination. It controlled the Nile River, which provided reliable agriculture in a region prone to drought. It dominated trade routes between Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. It had gold mines in Nubia, grain exports that fed the Mediterranean world, and a mystical religious prestige that commanded respect across the ancient world. Egypt was also independent, proud, unconquered by Persia. If Cambyses could conquer Egypt, he would prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. He would expand the empire in a direction Cyrus never had. He would be remembered not as Cyrus's son, but as a great king in his own right. In 525 BCE, Cambyses assembled an invasion force of 50,000 men, the largest army the Persian Empire had ever sent on a foreign campaign. The preparation took years. Ships were built. Alliances were forged. Intelligence was gathered. Darius was part of this army. He'd enlisted in the Immortals when he was 19 years old. The Immortals were the Persian Empire's elite fighting force, always maintained at exactly 10,000 men. When one died, he was immediately replaced, so the unit always appeared immortal. They were the best-trained, best-equipped soldiers in the world. Darius was proud to be an immortal. He'd fought in campaigns on the eastern frontier against the Scythians. He'd helped put down a rebellion in Babylon. He was good at his job, disciplined, loyal, skilled with the spear and bow. When the call came to join the Egypt expedition, Darius didn't hesitate. This would be the campaign that defined his generation. The conquest of Egypt would be talked about for centuries. He was right about that, just not in the way he expected. The Persian army invaded Egypt in 525 BCE, crossing the Sinai Desert and approaching the Nile Delta. The reigning pharaoh was Psamtik III, a young man who'd only been on the throne for 6 months. He assembled an army to meet the Persians at Pelusium, a fortress city on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. The Battle of Pelusium was fought in May 525 BCE. It was a slaughter. Darius was in the front ranks. He saw the Egyptian chariots charge across the sand, their wheels kicking up massive clouds of dust. He heard the Persian officers shout commands, and the Immortals moved as one. 10,000 men operating like a single organism, each soldier trusting the men beside him with his life. The Persian archers fired first. Thousands of arrows darkened the sky, falling on the Egyptian lines like deadly rain. Horses screamed and fell. Chariots crashed and overturned. Egyptian infantry broke formation and ran. The Persians advanced. Darius moved with his unit, shield locked with the shields of the men beside him, spear held ready. They hit the broken Egyptian line like a hammer striking glass. Darius killed 3 men that day. He doesn't remember their faces. He remembers the feel of his spear punching through leather armor and flesh. He remembers the sound a man makes when a spear enters his lungs. Not a scream, but a wet, gurgling gasp. He remembers stepping over bodies, his sandals slipping in blood-soaked sand. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the Egyptian army was destroyed. Psamtik III fled to Memphis with the remnants of his forces. The Persians pursued. Memphis was the ancient capital of Egypt, a city that had stood for 1,500 years. It was home to temples dedicated to Ptah, the creator god. The Apis bull, a sacred animal worshipped as the incarnation of Ptah, lived in a special temple complex. Memphis should have been impregnable, but Psamtik's army was broken. The people had no fight left in them. After a brief siege, the city opened its gates. Cambyses entered Memphis in triumph. He was crowned pharaoh of Egypt in an elaborate ceremony, taking the traditional Egyptian royal titles: King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Lord of the Two Lands, son of Darius was there. He stood in the crowd of soldiers as Cambyses ascended the throne. He saw the Egyptian priests bow to a foreign conqueror. He saw the Apis bull being led through the streets, adorned with gold and jewels. And he saw something else. Something in Cambyses's eyes that made him uneasy. Pride, yes. Triumph, certainly. But also a kind of wild intensity, a feverish gleam that suggested the king was seeing things differently than everyone else. After the conquest, a normal king would have consolidated his gains, established a government, secured supply lines, built alliances with local leaders, prepared for the long, boring work of actually ruling a new territory. Cambyses did none of these things. Instead, he became obsessed with 2 new conquests: the kingdom of Kush to the south and the oasis of Siwa to the west. Kush was in modern-day Sudan, south of Egypt along the Nile. It was rich in gold and had a proud military tradition. Cambyses sent an army of 30,000 men to conquer it. The army made it about 200 miles before they started starving and had to turn back. The campaign was a disaster, but at least the army survived. Siwa was different. Siwa was an oasis in the western desert, about 400 miles west of the Nile. It was home to the Oracle of Ammon, a temple where priests could supposedly communicate with the god Ammon, who the Greeks identified with Zeus. The oracle was legendary throughout the ancient world. Kings and generals traveled there to ask the gods about their fates. Alexander the Great would visit Siwa 200 years later, seeking confirmation that he was the son of Zeus. The oracle would tell him yes, he was divine, and Alexander would use this divine mandate to justify his conquest of the known world. But in 525 BCE, the oracle did something that would seal the fate of 50,000 men. It insulted Cambyses. According to Herodotus, the Greek historian who chronicled these events 75 years later, Cambyses sent envoys to the oracle asking if he was the legitimate pharaoh of Egypt, blessed by the gods. The oracle's response was brutal. The priests declared that Cambyses was a foreign usurper who had defiled the sacred temples of Egypt. They said he had killed the Apis bull, the sacred bull that was worshipped as the earthly incarnation of Ptah. According to the oracle, Cambyses had stabbed the bull in a fit of rage when the priests tried to explain its religious significance, dismissing it as just an animal. The oracle declared that Cambyses' reign was illegitimate. His conquest was cursed, and he would die mad and alone, hated by gods and men alike. This may or may not be true. Herodotus was Greek, and the Greeks had complicated feelings about Persia. Some of this might be propaganda, but what matters is what happened next. Cambyses, whether or not he actually killed the sacred bull, flew into a rage at the oracle's pronouncement. He would show these priests the price of insulting the king of Persia. He would burn their temple to the ground. He would drag the priests out and execute them in front of their own god. He would destroy the Oracle of Siwa. And so, in the spring of 524 BCE, Cambyses assembled an army of 50,000 men and ordered them to march west into the desert, conquer Siwa, and obliterate the oracle. Darius was among them. When the orders came down, Darius had misgivings. They all did. Every soldier who'd spent any time in Egypt had heard stories about the western desert. The Egyptians called it the Red Land, the domain of Set, the god of chaos and death. It was a place where men went mad from thirst, where mirages lured travelers to their deaths, where sandstorms could bury entire caravans. But Darius was a soldier. He followed orders. And besides, this was the Persian army, the greatest military force on earth. They'd conquered from India to Libya. They'd defeated the Egyptians in battle. A 400-mile desert march would be difficult but manageable, right? The army assembled in Thebes in late April 524 BC. 50,000 men. That's not a small force. It's the size of a modern division. Imagine trying to organize 50,000 people to walk 400 miles through one of the harshest environments on Earth. The logistics alone were staggering. Each soldier needed about 1 gallon, 4 liters, of water per day in desert conditions. That's 50,000 gallons per day for the whole army. For a 20-day march, the estimated time to reach Siwa, they'd need 1 million gallons of water. 1 million gallons. A water skin holds maybe half a gallon. A camel can carry about 50 gallons of water in containers. You'd need 20,000 camels just to carry the water for a 20-day march. The Persian army had maybe 2,000 camels. This is already a fatal miscalculation. But it gets worse. Because the plan wasn't to carry all the water, it was to resupply at oases along the route. The route from Thebes to Siwa had a series of oases. El-Khurga Oasis. 7 days west of Thebes, Bahariya Oasis. 7 days west of El-Khurga Siwa. 7 more days west. The plan was to march for 7 days, resupply at an oasis, march for 7 more days, resupply again, and then reach Siwa. Each leg required carrying only 7 days of water instead of 20. Much more manageable. Except the oases were barely adequate for small caravans. El-Khurga could support maybe 1,000 people comfortably. Bahariya was even smaller. The wells simply couldn't produce enough water for 50,000 men. And if anything went wrong, if they missed an oasis, if a well had dried up, if a sandstorm delayed them, the entire army would die. The officers knew this. Some of them advised against the campaign. An experienced desert guide named Cambyses, an Egyptian who joined the Persian service, explicitly told the commanders that the plan was suicide. 50,000 men couldn't be supported in the western desert. The largest caravan that had ever successfully crossed to Siwa was maybe 200 people, and even they lost men to the desert. The commanders ignored him. On May 1st, 524 BCE, the army marched west from Thebes. Darius was in the 3rd Division, part of a unit of Immortals serving as the army's elite corps. He carried his spear, 9 feet long, ashwood shaft, iron tip, his shield, round, 3 feet diameter, leather over wood, his short sword, 24 inches, iron, his bow and 30 arrows, his armor, leather and scale, about 25 pounds, a water skin, holding about half a gallon, a bag with dried dates, dried fish, and flatbread, maybe 5 days of food, personal items, a letter from his wife, a small clay amulet of Ahura Mazda, total weight, about 60 pounds of equipment in 95-degree heat. The first day was manageable. The army followed a well-traveled caravan route west along the desert edge. There was no shade, but the soldiers were still relatively fresh. They marched in the early morning and late afternoon, resting during the hottest part of the day. Darius walked alongside his friend Artabanus, a soldier from the same village back in Persia. They'd enlisted together 9 years ago. Artabanus was 31, married with 2 children. He was a competent soldier but not particularly ambitious, the kind of man who followed orders, did his job, and looked forward to retirement. "How long do you think this will take?" Artabanus asked on the first day. "Commander says 3 weeks to Siwa, maybe 2 weeks to destroy the Oracle, 3 weeks back. 2 months total. And then home. And then home." They both knew it was optimistic. Campaigns never went as planned. But 2 months seemed reasonable. By summer, they'd be back in Memphis. By autumn, maybe back in Persia. On the second day, the first men started collapsing from heat exhaustion. Heat exhaustion is the body's warning that it's overheating. Symptoms include heavy sweating, weakness, dizziness, nausea, headache, muscle cramps. If you catch it early, rest in shade and rehydration can solve it. But if you ignore it, it progresses to heat stroke, where the body's temperature regulation system completely fails. Your internal temperature rises above 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Your brain starts to cook. You become confused, delirious. You have seizures. You die. There was no shade in the desert, and rehydration required water that men were already rationing. The officers ordered the sick to be left with a water skin and a prayer. The army couldn't slow down for stragglers. If they recovered, they could catch up. If not, on the 3rd day they saw their first mirage. Mirages in the desert aren't just tricks of the light. They're optical illusions caused by temperature gradients in the air. Hot air near the ground refracts light from the sky, creating the appearance of water on the horizon. Your brain interprets this as a lake or pond. The mirages looked real. Darius saw what appeared to be a massive lake stretching across the horizon, complete with trees and buildings reflected in its surface. He knew intellectually that it was an illusion, but his brain, desperate for water, already mildly dehydrated, kept insisting it was real. Some men broke ranks and ran toward the mirages. The officers had to physically restrain them. One soldier, a young man named Bardia, managed to break free and sprinted toward a mirage about a mile off the route. They found his body the next day. He'd run until he collapsed, chasing water that didn't exist. On the 7th day, they reached El-Kurga oasis. El-Kurga was a small settlement built around a series of natural springs. In normal times, it supported maybe 500 permanent residents and could accommodate small caravans. 50,000 men descended on it like a plague of locusts. The wells couldn't keep up with the demand. Men fought over water. Soldiers with rank pulled rank to get to the wells first. The local inhabitants were pushed aside, their own water supplies confiscated by the army. The army stayed at El-Kurga for 3 days, trying to let the wells refill. But 50,000 men drink a lot of water, more than the springs could produce. When they left on day 10, the wells were nearly dry and the soldiers' water skins were only half full. The plan had been to resupply fully at El-Kurga. Instead, they were leaving with less water than they'd arrived with. And the next oasis was 7 days away. Darius knew, on some level, that this was when the campaign stopped being difficult and started being deadly. 7 days on half rations of water in the desert meant that men would start dying. He was right. On day 11, the first soldier died of dehydration. His name was Phraates. He was 24 years old, from a village near Susa. He'd been sick since El-Kurga, probably dysentery from drinking contaminated water at the oasis. Dysentery causes severe diarrhea, which dehydrates you even faster than normal. Phraates collapsed during the morning march. His unit stopped and tried to get him to drink water, but he couldn't keep it down. He vomited it back up, which just dehydrated him more. Within an hour, he was convulsing. His skin was hot and dry. He wasn't sweating anymore, which meant his body had no water left to spare. His eyes rolled back. Blood and foam came from his mouth where he'd bitten through his tongue. He died at noon with the sun directly overhead in 119-degree heat. They buried him in a shallow grave and moved on. By day 13, men were dying regularly, maybe 20 deaths per day. The officers ordered the army to march only at night and rest during the day, but it barely helped. Even at night, the temperature rarely dropped below 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and men were so dehydrated they couldn't produce sweat to cool themselves. The human body is about 60 water. When you're fully hydrated, you can sweat to cool yourself. But when you're dehydrated, sweating stops. Your blood thickens. Your heart has to work harder to pump the thickened blood. Your brain doesn't get enough oxygen. You become confused, disoriented. Darius noticed changes in himself on day 13. His urine had turned dark brown, almost black. This is a sign that your kidneys are shutting down, conserving every drop of water they can. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His skin felt wrong, tight and papery, like it didn't fit his body anymore. Artabanus was worse. He was older, and his body couldn't handle the dehydration as well. His hands shook constantly. His eyes were sunken deep in his skull. He barely spoke. Talking requires saliva, and there was none left. On day 14, they reached where Bahariya Oasis was supposed to be. The oasis was there, but it was nearly dry. Something had happened in the weeks since the army left Thebes. Maybe a dry winter, maybe the wells had shifted, maybe they just finally exceeded their natural capacity. Whatever the reason, the springs at Bahariya were producing maybe 1/10 of their normal output. There was enough water for a few hundred men, not 50,000. The army spent 2 days at Bahariya, with men taking turns at the wells. But the math was brutal. 50,000 men, each needing about a gallon per day, and the wells producing maybe 500 gallons per day. Most men got maybe half a cup of water. Some got nothing. This was the moment when the commanders should have turned back. They were 200 miles from Thebes, 200 miles from Siwa. They could retreat and maybe half the army would survive the march back to El-Kurga. But commanders don't like admitting failure. Turning back meant telling Cambyses that his grand expedition to destroy the Oracle had failed because they ran out of water. That they'd lost men to the desert without even reaching the enemy. The pride of commanders has killed a lot of soldiers throughout history. On day 16, the army left Bahariya and continued west towards Siwa. They had maybe 5 to 7 days of water left. Siwa was supposed to be 7 days away. It would be close. But if they pushed hard, if they rationed strictly, if they were lucky with the weather, they might make it. They weren't lucky. On day 18, the sandstorm hit. Darius saw it coming from the south. At first, it looked like a brown haze on the horizon. Then it grew and grew. Within 15 minutes, it was a wall of sand that stretched across the entire horizon, taller than mountains, moving toward them at about 30 miles per hour. The officers screamed orders. Get down. Cover your face. Tie cloth over your mouth and nose. Protect the water skins. But there was nowhere to hide. The desert was flat. No rocks, no buildings, no depressions in the ground. Just open sand in every direction. The storm hit like a physical blow. The wind knocked men off their feet. The sand was everywhere. In eyes, ears, mouths, lungs. Each breath pulled sand into your throat, making you cough, which pulled more sand in. Men choked, suffocated, died standing up, held upright by the wind and the press of bodies around them. Darius got down on his hands and knees, his head tucked down, his cloak wrapped around his face. The sand piled up on his back. He could feel the weight of it accumulating, burying him alive. The storm lasted for 3 days. 3 days of howling wind and stinging sand. 3 days with no food, no water, no movement. 3 days of men dying slowly, either from suffocation or from the sand stripping the skin from exposed flesh. When the storm finally stopped, Darius was buried up to his waist. He dug himself out, looked around. The desert had changed completely. Dunes that had been 10 feet tall were now flat. Areas that had been flat were now covered in 30-foot dunes. The landmarks they'd been using to navigate were gone. And so were most of the supplies. The camels were dead, either killed by the storm or buried so deep they'd suffocated. The water skins were torn to shreds by the wind-driven sand. The food stores were contaminated with sand. The army that had left Thebes 50,000 strong was now maybe 30,000. 20,000 men had died or been left behind in the first 18 days. And the remaining 30,000 had almost no water. The commander, General Bardia, a cousin of Cambyses, called a meeting of the senior officers. Darius wasn't part of it, but he heard about it later from his unit commander. The question was simple: turn back or push forward? Turning back meant a 200-mile march to Bahariya, which had almost no water. Then another 100 miles to El-Kurga. 300 miles through the desert with almost no supplies. Thousands more would die, but some might survive. Pushing forward meant 100 to 150 miles to Siwa. They weren't exactly sure how far, since the storm had disoriented them. If they could reach Siwa, they could resupply, rest, and then decide whether to continue the mission or retreat. Bardia chose to push forward. It was the wrong choice, but he didn't know that. On day 19, the army continued west, or what they thought was west. The storm had disoriented them, and without clear landmarks, navigation was guesswork. The water was gone, completely gone. Men had been rationing for days, and the storm had destroyed what little remained. This is when men started making desperate choices. Some tried drinking their own urine. This doesn't work. Urine contains urea, salt, and other waste products that your kidneys have removed from your blood. Drinking it just puts those toxins back in your system and makes you more dehydrated. But when you're dying of thirst, rational thought abandons you. Darius saw a man named Gobrias squat, urinate into his helmet, and drink it. Gobrias vomited it back up within minutes. The vomiting dehydrated him more. He was dead by nightfall. Others tried drinking camel blood. The camels were already dead from the storm, but some of the bodies were still relatively fresh. Men would cut the camel's throat, let blood drain into containers, and drink it warm. This worked slightly better than urine. Blood is mostly water, so it does provide some hydration. But it's also thick with salt and causes violent nausea in most people. And there weren't enough dead camels for 30,000 men. Some men, and the ancient sources confirm this, though they're vague about the details, began looking at each other differently. Human bodies are 60 water. If you're desperate enough. On day 20, Artabanus collapsed. He and Darius were walking together, as they had been for 19 days. Artabanus had been getting weaker for the past 3 days. Barely able to walk, his speech slurred and confused. He stopped, swayed, and fell face first into the sand. Darius tried to help him up, but Artabanus was too far gone. His skin was hot and dry. His pulse was weak and irregular. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. Water, Artabanus whispered. Darius had no water. Nobody had water. I'm sorry, Darius said. Artabanus smiled, or tried to. His cracked lips pulled back from his teeth in something that might have been a smile or might have been a grimace of pain. Tell my wife. Artabanus started. But he never finished. His eyes went blank. His breathing stopped. Darius's best friend died in his arms, in the middle of the desert, 250 miles from anywhere. The unit kept moving. They had to. Stop moving and you die. Darius left Artabanus's body in the sand. He didn't bury it. He didn't have the strength. 3 hours later, when Darius looked back, he saw shapes moving around Artabanus's body. Other soldiers, collapsed from exhaustion, had found the corpse. Darius didn't look back again. On day 21, men started walking off alone into the desert. Not deserting, they were too far gone for that. They were hallucinating, seeing things that weren't there. Their brains, starved of oxygen and water, were malfunctioning, creating visions of salvation that didn't exist. A soldier named Achaemenes saw his mother calling to him from behind a sand dune. He told his unit he was going to talk to her. They tried to stop him, but he pulled away and walked off into the desert, calling "Mother, Mother," until his voice faded into the distance. Another man saw the gates of Persepolis shimmering on the horizon. He ran toward it, laughing, shouting that they were home. He disappeared over a dune and never came back. Darius saw Roxana, his wife. She was standing about 50 yards away, holding their baby. She was smiling, beckoning him. He knew it wasn't real. He knew his wife was in Persepolis, 2,000 miles away. He knew his baby hadn't even been born yet. But part of his brain insisted it was real. Insisted that if he just walked over there, he could hold his wife, see his child, go home. Darius closed his eyes, counted to 10. When he opened them, the vision was still there. He forced himself to look away and keep walking. On day 22, Darius's unit fragmented. They'd been 200 men when they left Thebes. They were down to maybe 50. The unit commander was dead heat stroke on day 20. The surviving soldiers were following a senior soldier named Hystaspes. But Hystaspes was as lost and confused as everyone else. The unit had become just a loose collection of men walking in roughly the same direction. Some walked faster, some slower. The group spread out over several miles. Darius was near the back. His body was shutting down. His kidneys had stopped producing urine days ago. His heart beat irregularly, sometimes racing, sometimes barely beating at all. His vision was tunneling. He could only see directly ahead, the peripheral vision gone dark. He was in the final stages of multi-organ failure. On day 23, Darius collapsed. His legs simply stopped working. One moment he was walking, the next moment he was on the ground and couldn't get up. He tried to stand. His muscles wouldn't respond. He lay in the sand, watching the other soldiers walk past him. A few looked down at him. One man, Darius didn't know his name, knelt beside him. "Can you walk?" the man asked. Darius shook his head. The man hesitated. Then he stood up and walked away. This was standard practice. The dying were left behind. There was no other choice. You couldn't carry them, everyone was too weak. You couldn't stay with them, that meant dying yourself. You said a prayer and moved on. Darius lay in the sand for what felt like hours. The sun hammered down on him. The heat was a physical thing, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He thought about Roxana. He wondered if she'd gotten his last letter, the one he'd sent from Memphis before the army marched west. He wondered if the baby would be a boy or a girl. He wondered if they'd name the child after him. He thought about Artabanus, and whether his body was still out there in the sand or whether the desert had already reclaimed it. He thought about the Oracle of Siwa. Had they been trying to reach it this entire time? Or had they been going in circles, lost and doomed from the moment they left Bahariya? He thought about Cambyses, sitting in his palace in Memphis, waiting for news of a great victory. And then Darius stopped thinking about anything at all. His body, finally free of the burden of consciousness, began the process of dying. His heart beat slower, slower, the irregular rhythm becoming more pronounced, the pauses between beats stretching longer. His core temperature rose to 108 degrees Fahrenheit. His brain, cooking inside his skull, began to shut down. Neurons died by the millions. Memories disappeared. The electrical patterns that made Darius who he was flickered and went dark. His last breath was at sunset on the 23rd day of the march. Darius died at 28 years old, 250 miles from anywhere, in a desert that had already killed tens of thousands and would kill thousands more. His body remained in the sand, slowly mummifying in the dry heat. Over the following days, it was buried by wind-blown sand. Within a week, there was no sign he'd ever been there. Darius was one of 50,000. But what happened to the rest of the army? Here's what we know from historical sources. Herodotus, writing 75 years after the event, says the entire army vanished. Not a single man returned. No survivors. No word of what happened. The army simply ceased to exist. Herodotus claims his source was Egyptian priests, who heard the story from Bedouin desert traders. According to this account, the army was hit by a massive sandstorm, bigger than any in living memory. The storm buried the entire army alive. 50,000 men entombed in sand in a matter of hours. But there's a problem with this account. If no one survived, how does anyone know what happened? For 2,500 years, most historians dismissed Herodotus's account as exaggeration or myth. A colorful story, but not literally true. Until 2009. In 2009, two Italian archaeologists, Angelo and Alfredo Castiglione, announced a discovery that shocked the archaeological world. In the Sahara Desert, about 60 miles southwest of the Siwa oasis, they found evidence of a massive military encampment. The evidence included human remains, hundreds of individuals, possibly thousands, bronze weapons matching Persian military designs, armor fragments consistent with Persian army equipment, metal artifacts with old Persian inscriptions, evidence of sudden, catastrophic burial by sand, distribution patterns suggesting an army in retreat. Spread over 180 miles, the Castiglione brothers spent years analyzing the site. The human remains showed signs of death by dehydration and exposure. The distribution patterns suggested the army had fragmented into smaller groups, possibly trying to retreat toward Egypt. Carbon dating was inconclusive. Organic material is scarce in the desert. But the artifact styles matched the early Persian period, exactly when Cambyses' army would have passed through. The Italian team believes they found Cambyses' Lost Army. Not everyone agrees. Some archaeologists argue the evidence is inconclusive. The dating is uncertain. The remains could be from other Persian expeditions. The Persians campaigned in Egypt multiple times over the following centuries. The sample size, hundreds of remains out of supposedly 50,000, is too small to be definitive. But the Castiglione discovery reignited interest in the Lost Army. Other expeditions followed. In 2014, a German team found additional Persian-era artifacts in the same region. In 2019, satellite imagery analysis identified possible mass graves in the area. The consensus among archaeologists today is something catastrophic happened to a Persian army in the Western Desert around 524 BCE. Whether it was specifically Cambyses' 50,000-man expedition to Siwa or a different force remains uncertain. But the evidence suggests Herodotus was right. The army was caught in the desert, ran out of water, and was buried by sand. Darius, the soldier we've been following, is out there somewhere. His mummified remains buried under tons of sand, waiting to be discovered 2,500 years after he collapsed in the desert. And what happened to Cambyses? When news reached Memphis that the army hadn't returned, Cambyses waited. Weeks passed, then months. No word, no survivors, no explanation, just silence. Cambyses sent scouts to investigate. None returned. He sent messengers to the oases. They reported that a large army had passed through El-Kurga heading west, but never came back. 50,000 men had vanished into the desert. According to ancient sources, this broke something in Cambyses' mind. The historical accounts describe Cambyses' descent into madness. He executed his own brother, Bardia, different from General Bardia who led the Lost Army, on suspicion of treason. This would later cause a succession crisis when an impostor claiming to be Bardia seized the throne. He married his own sister, Atossa, in violation of Persian law and custom. When she criticized him for killing their brother, he kicked her while she was pregnant, causing a miscarriage. She died from internal bleeding. He ordered the tombs of previous pharaohs to be opened and desecrated, mocking the mummies and burning sacred texts. He laughed during Egyptian religious ceremonies and stabbed the Apis bull, if he hadn't already done so, calling it a demon and a false god. He executed advisors who questioned his decisions. He became paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere. Whether all of this is true or anti-Persian propaganda is debatable. But what's certain is that Cambyses' reign after the loss of the army was brief and chaotic. In 522 BCE, just 2 years after the army vanished, a rebellion broke out in Persia. A man claiming to be Bardia, Cambyses' executed brother, seized the throne. Claiming Cambyses was a murderer and usurper, Cambyses immediately left Egypt with his remaining forces to put down the rebellion. He never made it home. While traveling through Syria, Cambyses died under mysterious circumstances. The official story is that he accidentally stabbed himself in the thigh while mounting his horse. The wound became infected and killed him within days. Most historians believe he was assassinated. Some think he committed suicide. Either way, Cambyses died at age 35, just 7 years after becoming king. His epitaph, according to Herodotus, should have been, "He conquered Egypt and destroyed himself." The loss of 50,000 men, the largest single military disaster in Persian history up to that point, nearly destroyed the empire. It took a new king, Darius I, not our soldier Darius, a different man entirely who was part of the coup that overthrew the false Bardia, to stabilize the empire and prevent its collapse. The story of Cambyses' Lost Army became a legend, a cautionary tale about hubris, a reminder that even the greatest empires could be humbled by nature. For 2,500 years, it was just a story, a myth, an exaggeration, until 2009, when archaeologists started finding the bodies. What can we learn from this catastrophe? The story of Cambyses' Lost Army is a masterclass in what happens when ambition, hubris, and poor planning collide with the brutal reality of nature. Cambyses made every mistake a commander can make. 1. He fought the wrong enemy. The desert wasn't an obstacle to overcome on the way to fighting the Oracle. The desert was the enemy, and it was more dangerous than any human army. 2. He ignored expert advice. The Egyptians knew the desert. They could have told him the expedition was impossible. He either never asked or ignored them. 3. His logistics were catastrophically inadequate. 50,000 men needed 1,000,000 gallons of water for a 20-day march. The army carried maybe 50,000 gallons. That's not a supply shortage, that's suicide. 4. He prioritized pride over pragmatism. This wasn't a strategic conquest. This was revenge against an oracle that insulted him. He killed 50,000 men because his feelings were hurt. 5. The commanders didn't turn back when they should have. At Bahariya, when it became clear the wells were inadequate, turning back would have saved thousands of lives. But admitting failure was worse than death. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Napoleon's 1812 Russian campaign. 600,000 men invaded Russia. Fewer than 100,000 returned. Not defeated by the Russian army primarily, but by winter, starvation, and logistics failures. The German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. 300,000 men surrounded and destroyed. Most died from starvation and cold, not combat. The British retreat from Kabul, 1842. 16,500 soldiers and civilians retreating from Afghanistan. One survivor reached Jalalabad. The French Foreign Legion at Cameroon, 1863. 65 legionnaires fought 2,000 Mexican soldiers. The battle is legendary for French military honor. What's less discussed? The legion was undersupplied because logistics failed. Armies don't usually lose because they're outfought. They lose because they're outsupplied, outplanned, and outprepared. And the desert is particularly unforgiving. In World War II, the North Africa campaign saw tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. Not from combat, but from heat, thirst, dysentery, and equipment failure in the desert environment. Modern armies with trucks, radios, helicopters, GPS, and satellite weather forecasting still struggle with desert warfare. Cambyses' army had leather water skins, leather armor, and the mistaken belief that willpower could overcome environmental reality. Couldn't. The desert doesn't care about your empire. It doesn't care about your military prowess. It doesn't care about your pride or your mission or your God. The desert cares about one thing, water. And if you don't have enough water, you die. It's that simple. Darius learned this lesson. So did 49,999 other men. Their bodies are still out there, under the sand, bearing silent witness to the deadliest logistics failure in ancient history. This is Ash and Crown History, where we explore the moments that changed the world. Not the sanitized version, but the brutal truth. If you want to see more stories like this, the catastrophic failures, the human cost of hubris, the archaeological mysteries that are still being solved, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Because next time we're covering another desert disaster. The Children's Crusade of 1212, when 30,000 children marched from Europe toward the Holy Land, believing God would part the Mediterranean Sea for them like he parted the Red Sea for Moses. Spoiler alert, he didn't. And what happened to those children? Sold into slavery, died of disease, starved on the march, was worse than anything that happened to Cambyses' army. Drop a comment and tell me, what other lost armies should we cover? The Lost Legion of Varus in Germania? The Spanish Armada? The 9th Legion in Britain? The French at Dien Bien Phu? Your comments shape what we explore next. 50,000 men walked into the western desert in 524 BCE. 0 came back. Their bones are still there, buried under the sand, waiting to tell their story. That's the story they don't teach you in school. That's the story we tell here. Thanks for watching. This is Ash and Crown History, where the past is never boring, and the lessons are written in sand and blood.